Hello and welcome to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. In this hour, what are the psychological challenges for children and young people amidst this time of COVID-19? Contributing host Lillian Ng speaks with Hiran Thabrew and Melanie Woodfield about the ways that families can support their children and adolescents.
What psychological challenges do children and young people face amidst COVID-19? To explore this question, I'm joined by Hiran Thabrew and Melanie Woodfield. Hiran is a paediatrician and child and adolescent psychiatrist with research interests in e-health, and Melanie Woodfield is a clinical psychologist and researcher in parent wellbeing and child conduct problems. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Looking through a child's lens, how might they be viewing the world at this very strange time?
It is a strange time, and I think one of the areas in which it's strange is that when small children think about threats are usually obvious and tangible, and I mean, you think of tigers and ghosts and baddies, and just out of interest, that's one of the reasons why we need quite nuanced and sophisticated teaching around stranger danger. I think one of the challenges for young children at this time is that the threat that we're facing is intangible, it's invisible. And for small children who struggle with abstract reasoning, with kind of making sense of things that they can't necessarily see or hear, some of the things that we're being asked to do don't make a lot of sense. We're being asked to wash our hands to keep ourselves safe, or to stay away from grandma to keep her safe. I mean, those things really don't make sense to a young child. And at a very practical level, there have been lots of changes for small children. You know, schools closed, kindies closed, no more play dates, playground trips, and parents are in a different space than they used to be. They might be physically present more often, but maybe a bit preoccupied or perhaps less emotionally available.
What about young people who are facing disruption to their social networks, to their group activities, to schooling? How might this affect their development?
Yeah, one of the things I think we need to remember is that school is much, much more than just academic learning. It's almost a microcosm of society for adolescents. And in some very practical ways, it's important. We know that schools are often one of the first places that adolescents seek help. Schools are very common referrers to community-based mental health services for adolescents, for example. There are often good relationships between young people and teaching staff and deans and guidance staff at schools. So there's that very practical consideration, but also the social isolation of not being at school, particularly in a season for adolescents where identity formation is happening. They're figuring out who they are, and that process normally happens in relationship with others. And look, we've heard some high-profile psychologists in the media reassuring us that getting a PhD or not won't come down to the couple of weeks of lost schooling in the midst of the pandemic, and I agree with that. But I do think it's important that we remember that young people have a variety of needs that aren't necessarily just academic.
Can you talk a little bit more about some of those needs and how that might play out in the home when young people and children are observing their parents?
It's hard. I mean, I don't know about others, but certainly I think we can struggle to, there's such variety of where young people are at and such differences in their family circumstances. We have the great digital divide, for example. You know, some young people remain very connected socially despite being at home, whereas others won't. We have some young people in overcrowded situations at home where it's difficult to get privacy so that you can connect with your best friend or your partner. And some young people will be having to pick up some caretaking roles for younger siblings or for older family members while mums, dads, parents are working in the home, for example.
So how can families help children and young people get through this time?
I think there's a few things that families can certainly do. The first is to keep regular routines and schedules as much as possible, or create new ones in a new environment like your bubble, and make sure that you include time for learning, but also time for playing and time for relaxing. These routines do offer structure and predictability and make children feel safe. The second thing, which might be easier to said than done, is to stay as calm as possible yourself under the circumstances and given the uncertainties, and try to discuss your own worries with other adults away from children as much as possible. Limiting the amount of time you spend talking about COVID-19 in particular, and watching the news or checking information online can also be useful for yourself to ameliorate your own anxiety, but also kind of to reduce the amount of time that your children and young people are spent focusing on that as well. As Mel has indicated, I think children can be a bit confused by some of the instructions right now, but some of them can also be helpful. Certainly giving your children specific things that they can do to feel in control, like washing their hands, eating well to stay healthy, getting lots of sleep, and doing nice things for others, especially grandparents that they may not be able to see for a while, like making cards or sort of sending e-messages, e-video messages can be very helpful. As long as they understand why they need to do the things they're being asked to do, they'll probably appreciate that. I think being a good role model is also really important. So if you're asking your kids to wash their hands, then make sure that they see you doing that as well. If you're asking them to kind of look after their mental health and relax, then it's important that you do the same. And if you model how you use a menu of self-care activities, such as taking regular walks and breaks for reading or talking with friends, then they're more likely to copy you than to listen to what you say. There's a number of e-health interventions as well. This is one of my areas of interest, so I'll talk a bit about this, that are also out there, from youth-oriented tools like Aroha, which is a new chatbot designed at Auckland University, to adult-oriented relaxation apps like Calm and Breathe that can also be used very easily by adolescents.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Aroha, the chatbot?
So Aroha was designed at the University of Auckland by the eHealth team and the Department of Psychological Medicine. And it's a chatbot that helps young people identify the type of feelings that they're having and the type of worries particularly, and also learn a new set of coping strategies for dealing with particularly COVID-19 related anxiety. It's brand new. It's been co-designed with young people from New Zealand, including those of Māori and Pacific ethnicity. And we're really excited to kind of see it launched in the last week or so, and hoping that it will be used by a lot of young people around the country.
The family bubble is very important at the moment. So what should parents say to children and young people who may feel very worried about what's happening in the world at the moment?
Yeah, there's certainly a number of kids who are going to be in this situation at the moment. The first thing to do is to find out what kids actually know in an age-appropriate way. So if they're really young, you could just ask in more general terms about whether they've heard grown-ups talking about a new illness, or older children could be asked more specifically, if they've heard so-and-so talking about COVID or coronavirus. Find out how they obtain the information in case you need to manage any particularly unhelpful sources of information. The key message when it comes to talking about kids about difficult things like this is to follow their lead. Some kids want to spend a lot of time talking, and others don't want to talk at all. The ones who don't will usually ask more when they're ready, or they might ask for information in bite-sized chunks as you go along, or while you're doing other activities. Just use the opportunities to tell them what they need to know to the extent that they want to. But if you tell them more than they need to, it might just worry them. When you're answering questions, try and be as honest, as comforting, and use age-appropriate language as much as possible. Try not to give them false reassurance, because kids can usually tell when you're lying. And so if you don't know the answer to a question, say you don't know, and use the opportunity to find out together using a reliable internet resource. But talk to them about all the things that are happening to keep people safe and healthy in hospitals, in the community, and also things that they can do at home. It's good to talk about COVID and what's happening for about 5 minutes a day. Certainly have a regular check-in time, but I wouldn't say that it's useful to kind of keep talking about it all through the day, as this just maintains any anxiety that might already be there. But if you notice that despite doing the things I've said, your kids are still having difficulty, they're overtly anxious, they're having difficulty with their eating or their sleep, or their concentration, or they start to act out. And particularly this might include something we call regression, where kids go back to doing things that they've outgrown, like wetting the bed or sleepwalking or having nightmares. Then you might want to get some help from your local child and adolescent mental health service.
What other psychological issues might arise from this quarantine period? We're amidst it, but as we emerge from quarantine, there are likely to be some additional difficulties.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the short answer, which is very unsatisfactory, but the short answer is we actually just don't know. I mean, this situation is really unprecedented. That word has been used so often in this season, but we just don't know. I know there's a really recent Lancet paper that I was quite interested in that came out just a wee while ago, and it was sort of a call for action for mental health science in terms of, and it was an interdisciplinary group of experts saying we really need to get ready to get stuck in terms of researching what the effects of this pandemic have been on our emotional well-being. So the short answer is we don't know. What I would say to parents listening is that there's a really wide range of normal, and that, as Hiran said, things like developmental regression are actually really common, and in many cases will be just a normal reflection of the unsettled season that we've had. So I think people don't necessarily need to panic if their child has started to bedwet again, or has been a bit more clingy, or a few more meltdowns, to just see that as quite probably a normal part of the adjustment process. So a wide range of normal. Some children will be really vocal and verbal about their distress and their concern. Some children are very sensitive. Other children might actually be quite quiet and sort of solemn, but might actually be doing okay. So it's really hard to say what the psychological issues may be. Most people are saying that we're likely to see a rise in anxiety, possibly specifically PTSD. But the short answer, which, as I say, is really unsatisfactory, is we really don't know yet.
How can we encourage children and young people to express themselves, or help them process their emotions, particularly when they're not inclined to articulate them?
Children deal with things in different ways, depending on their developmental stage and age, but also on their individual personalities. I think for most parents, if you've got adolescents, you know that there comes a time when you stop talking to them face to face because they'll just say nah or dunno to every question. And you're better off just to have the conversation in the car, like when you're side by side. So all kids are different, and they go through different stages where they'll respond to information in different ways. So as I said before, follow their lead, tell them, find out what they know, tell them as much as they want to know, and be prepared to come back to information and repeat it a number of times in layers until they understand enough.
You mentioned children picking up on parents' stress, and children and young people are observing their parents and likely seeing a high level of preoccupation. What advice do you have for parents and caregivers about how they can manage their own worries?
Well, I think there's a number of things parents can do. You're absolutely right. They are as important to kind of children's mental health as the things that children will be doing directly. The first thing is acknowledge that what's going on is real, and that it is weird and unprecedented, as Mel has said, and that so might your feelings about it be. It can be useful to try and figure out how you're feeling and kind of name the feelings, whether it's worry or anxiety, and also try and develop some system for keeping an eye on them. So some people find that having a rating out of 10 just to know I'm anxious and I feel like a 9 is quite helpful. For other people, it could just be like a traffic light system. I'm a red right now. I need to kind of stop and do something about this. Try and devise some kind of system for yourself, and just check in with yourself once a day as well, just to see how you've been in the last day, because that will give you an idea about what you might need to do. If you're feeling fine, if your number's on the low side, if you're in the green zone, then you may just be able to carry on. If you're sort of amber, or kind of your number's in the middle, you might need to actually slow down for a bit. And if you're red or your number's high, you might need to actually just say, I think I need to pause. I need to kind of put a few things I was going to do today on hold and do some self-care, and then come back to them. There's no magic answer to how to cope. Different people do things in different ways. So try and find out kind of what works for you. You might have some clues from things that have happened to you in the past as to kind of your favorite coping strategies. Going for a run, reading a book, talking to friends. But if these were not so healthy ones, like drinking alcohol or using substances, then try and avoid doing these again. Once you've developed a menu of self-care strategies, make sure you use them. Try and limit the amount of time you spend on social media, especially looking up stories about COVID-19. It can really be hard, but if you just try, maybe even just checking Facebook a couple of times in the next day rather than 10 times a day, see what difference that makes.
We live within a multicultural society, and sometimes our young people are confronted by really difficult topics like racism, which seems to be an additional issue at the moment. What advice do you have for parents about talking about it with their children?
It's definitely an issue at the moment in New Zealand, but also in many parts of the world. As people are scared, it's useful to kind of want to blame other people and pick on particular cultures or races. The first thing to say is to try and model compassion and non-racist, non-stigmatizing speech yourself. So try not to stereotype people in countries when you're talking with your kids or with other adults. Talk about people who get or acquire the virus rather than those who transmit or spread it. And try not to talk about things like plagues or apocalypse. Provide accurate information about COVID-19 and explain that even though it originated from a geographical area in China, viruses don't recognize race, ethnicity, or nationality. And then if there has been any harassment or bullying that your child describes, you need to address it. If they've said or done something, you need to let them know it's not okay. And if they've witnessed something like that between friends, then talk about how they can deal with it if it happens again. If they've been the victim, and particularly if they're upset by it, you might need to make a plan of how to deal with that with them and also with others like their friends or people at school once school starts again. One of the things about these kind of issues is that they can be opportunities as well to educate kids about racism and discrimination. So you can do this in many ways by emphasizing positive, familiar individuals from different groups, identifying heroes from different cultural backgrounds. For older kids, reading books or watching movies that kind of address racial intolerance, prejudice, racism, and hatred. There's many ways in which you can get your kids to learn a lot about the world and what's right and wrong through a time like this.
How can families support the young people to feel safe and connected?
Kids feel contained, they feel secure when things are predictable and familiar. I guess some practical things, trying to keep the family routine the same around bedtimes, meal times, and other sort of rhythms of daily life. I prefer to talk about rhythms than routines. And even for adolescents, not necessarily allowing limitless time on screens if you wouldn't normally. Having some firm but warm limits and boundaries is actually really containing for young people and children. I think it's tempting to think, oh, this is such a difficult time for us all. Let's just go with the flow and not have any sort of boundaries or limits. But maybe paradoxically, children actually thrive with limits and boundaries that are warm and that are fair. The reality is many of us are juggling work expectations. We're juggling our own well-being, our own stress, our own fears for the future. And I think it's important that parents don't beat themselves up if there are times when they're tearful in front of the children or have watched the news for 5 minutes when they know they probably should turn it off or something like that. I think it's important to just acknowledge that we are human, we are not robots, and that sometimes things will happen that in the ideal world we know we probably wouldn't have done. What I would say is it's really useful to debrief those situations with kids. So if you've been a bit snappy with your partner, for example, it's useful to sort of resolve the conflict, if you like, and not leave it unresolved. So, I'm feeling a bit stressed at the moment, and that means that I was a bit more snappy than I usually am, and maybe you're feeling a bit stressed as well. With really young kids under about 6, they tend to be what we call developmentally egocentric. So they tend to attribute parents' sort of emotional state changes to their own behaviour, their own actions. So if mum has tears in her eyes, the 4-year-old or 5-year-old might be inclined to think it's because of something that they did. And as we know, 9 times out of 10, it's not. So it's really useful to say to kids, I'm upset because I'm thinking about grandma and I really miss her. So I guess just some practical considerations for the younger kids there.
Do you have any specific advice about frequency and access to technology? Just aware that quite a lot of our young people are accessing social media, and it may be sometimes unsupervised due to parental commitments and preoccupation.
there are things online that are helpful and supportive and connective, and there are things online that are less helpful. And as Hiran was saying, sometimes it's about the frequency, it's about what they're accessing, how often they're accessing it, and whether that is fostering well-being. If we think about what young people need, they need connectedness, they need so some of the online gaming can provide that, for example, but sometimes it doesn't. So I struggle to provide a blanket sort of set of guidance there. I think it will be quite specific to each family's circumstance, but maybe just step back and think, what is this online activity providing for my child or for my young person?
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of those sentiments because I think young people these days particularly are living in a much more connected world, and they are digital natives. They're not growing up like we grew up with books and television and black and white or color or whatever. So they are going to be much more familiar with it, and now even in school they're going to be encouraged to use technology kind of to learn as well a lot more now immediately, especially, but also going forward. There was a BNZ ad a few years ago, some of you may remember, which sort of said money, it's not good, it's not bad, it's what you do with it. And I feel the same is true for technology. It's here to stay with us, and we need to find more ways of using it in a helpful way than in an unhelpful way.
I mean, there are some unhelpful forums out there, and young people may be cyberbullied. So is that a particular issue of concern as we emerge from COVID-19, where they've been spending a lot of time online together? And it may be more prominent.
Yeah, I think cyberbullying is definitely an increasing issue and one we're becoming more aware of. However, there's face-to-face bullying hasn't gone away despite cyberbullying increasing. Obviously, with kids being more at home and being less at school, there's been less of the face-to-face bullying. So relatively, it's possible that cyberbullying might have gone up. I think, once again, young people being on sites where they're unsupervised and getting into dangerous kind of agreements and arrangements with friends in an inadequately supervised manner is what is more likely to make it more likely to happen. If it does happen, I suppose the important thing for young people is that they can reach out to their parents, that they know they've got an open door there, that they won't be judged, that they can actually go to them and talk about what's happened and get some help about how to deal with it. So make sure that you do leave that door open for young people. You can't monitor everything they're doing. It's physically impossible. You can only set them up with the ground rules and the education about how to use their technology in the right way. But if they're not using them, if that doesn't happen or anything happens to them despite them doing the right thing, especially cyberbullying, then let them know that it's important that they come to you.
Are there any particular groups of children or young people who are more likely to be at risk of psychological problems?
Children with pre-existing psychological issues, particularly anxiety and depression, may be more vulnerable to an increase in symptoms during lockdown or in the months afterwards, especially if family finances are limited, if parents become unemployed, if sort of family stress increases. So they'd be one group to watch out for. Another couple of groups are young people from Māori and Pacific Island backgrounds and those with long-term physical conditions who historically have had sort of increased rates of anxiety, depression, mental health problems. One might think that they might be more vulnerable under these situations. However, I'd like to make it clear that there's no clear evidence that they actually fare worse during crises such as pandemics. Time may tell. More clearly, children of essential workers are likely to be facing additional dilemmas at the moment. Many of them will be missing their parents who are at work. They'll be worrying about whether they're safe or not. And they'll also be worrying about catching COVID-19 from their parents when they return home. So these worries are probably balanced out by, for the majority of children, having greater access to their parents, having less academic and social demands, having sort of, flexible but clear routines at home and regular opportunities to connect with family and friends. So it's quite possible that for some of them, they might actually be doing better during this period of isolation or lockdown where they have more family support and connection. For some, it might not be being in isolation, but it might be returning to school and back to normal routines. That's more challenging. But fortunately, most parents know how to manage these times from the experience of getting back to regular routines, say after long school holidays. So I'd just advise that they reuse effective strategies to manage these transitions.
A lot of the focus at the moment is on protecting and promoting psychological well-being, as well as preventing mental health conditions from emerging. And I think parents are doing a lot at the moment. They're teaching, working, parenting, working remotely. They're trying to keep their children busy and safe at home, and it's quite a daunting prospect. Do you have any final reflections on what can be done to support parents at this time?
I just come back to that parents are not robots. It's not about learning more, doing more. That's a common theme that I've observed, is that parents feel compelled to just do more, to, digest the 20 emails a day that arrive from the child's school, to become an expert in homeschooling overnight, to continue to perform at the pre-pandemic level in terms of working from home, and this is a lot, and in many cases overwhelming, especially where parents already might have struggled with big emotions, might have struggled with sadness, with stress, with anxiety, with kind of big feelings that got in the way. It sounds so trite, but I really think it's important. In the airplane, the air hostess says, put your own oxygen mask on first before you see to your children. Often parents won't do that in practical ways at home because it feels selfish, or it feels, I should put my child's needs first. But actually, looking after your own needs is really, really important. Parenting effectively is not just about knowledge and skills. It's actually being about being able to connect with that knowledge and skill through being well yourself. So whatever that looks like for you as a parent, it'll look different for everyone. It's really important to top up your own tank, whether that's getting out and going for a walk, and to not feel bad or guilty about doing that. That will actually restore your ability to continue to meet your child's needs. It is a really tough time. We have to acknowledge that, and we have to be kind to ourselves.
I completely agree with being kind to yourself. I think it's so important, and I think that for your kids to see you doing that, to actually model those things that you're talking about, to actually use every opportunity which doesn't go so well to kind of, do a bit of reflection, do a bit of learning, to show them that, this is being human, this is being real. Being your best is actually about being human under all circumstances, not trying to be perfect in some artificial way, but, to kind of balance all those different tasks and responsibilities that we have, and also look after ourselves through that process. I think there are some opportunities at this time, but for sure, a lot of parents are going to have found a lot of extra work over the last few weeks because of the demands of the workplace. Now that things like Zoom and technology are so easily available, well, why can't we be there? But it doesn't mean that we have the mental space to kind of do all of that and all the extra as well. So we would have already been prioritizing what we can do, what we can leave till later. And I think we need to practice doing that for a lot longer, because it's not just what's happening at the moment. It's also coming out of lockdown and the uncertainty about how long this is going to last, whether this is going to be a month, whether we're going to go in and out of different phases of lockdown. We need to be prepared for a bit of a roller coaster and kind of and remember that this is a marathon and not a sprint.
So thank you to Hiran Thabrew and Melanie Woodfield for helping me explore this question about what psychological challenges children and young people face amidst this time of COVID-19. And thank you to our audience for listening.
And that's it for today's show. Thank you to all of our guests and to those who make this program possible. To Sud Dongre, our webmaster, Ankine Arasian, Melissa Chiprin, Mike Hurst, and Tim Page. Most of all, thank you for listening. If you missed part of the show, you can check out our archives at scholarcircle.org, kpfk.org, and please like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at Armoodian, and we'll see you next week.